Hi there, and welcome to the Grief and Rebirth podcast. I'm your host, author and trauma survivor Irene Weinberg, here to encourage you wherever you are in your healing journey. In each episode, I chat with incredible grief and trauma specialists, healers, mediums, and celebs, as well as remarkable people who have inspiring healing stories to share. If you're looking for a podcast that's both uplifting and inspiring, you've found it. Let us help you find your joy in life. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds each of you so very well. I'm speaking to you from my studio in West Orange, New Jersey, and I could not be more delighted to have the pleasure of interviewing the accomplished Suzanne Anderson, who is an author, a psychologist, an executive coach, an international speaker, and the founder of the Mysterial Woman Initiative, a social enterprise that is dedicated to the awakening, development, and support of women as integral leaders shaping a positive future for all beings. Suzanne was born in Toronto, and she will be speaking to us today from Vashon, Washington. She holds an MA in clinical psychology from Antioch University in Seattle, and she also pursued a postgraduate diploma in restoration architecture at the University of Florence, Italy. She was the co-creator of a highly acclaimed worldwide women's empowerment program in the 1990s, and she founded an international consultancy and worked for over a decade with Fortune 500 companies, 7 of those years based in Paris. After decades working as a senior leadership consultant, Suzanne recognized the absence of leadership programs designed to address women's development. She has dedicated the last 15 years to decoding an embodied, integral, and accelerated pathway to unlock women's innate potential, and her multifaceted, deep approach to her work rests in a grounded spiritual path that is a vital aspect of Suzanne's life today. Suzanne co-authored the triple award-winning book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. Her new book, titled You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss, is part memoir and part guidebook, taking the reader on Suzanne's journey through trauma and grief after her beloved husband took his life, and with it, her life as she knew it. Suzanne faced a choice. Would she be broken down and defeated, or broken open and transformed? I'm looking forward to talking with Suzanne about how her developmental years set the stage for later guiding women to awaken to their full feminine and masculine strengths, the key spiritual practices that allowed her to navigate her grief, betrayal, and loss after her husband's suicide, the shifts and transformations in her relationships during her healing journey, the themes of awakening the deep feminine and healing unconscious wounds in the DNA in her new book, What is the Mysterial Woman and Mysterial Leadership, and more for what is surely going to be an enlightening, moving interview with a truly remarkable woman. Hi, Suzanne. A heartfelt welcome to Grief and Rebirth podcast.
Thank you, Irene. That was beautiful. Just walking through so many aspects of my life. Thank you for that.
You're so welcome. You're welcome to lift it and use it in other places. It'll be broadcast in many arenas here through the podcast. And you are amazing. As I was studying and preparing the interview, I was like, wow, this is a really remarkable woman. So I so admired all of your accomplishments. So let's set the stage for this remarkable woman who came onto this planet. How did your developmental years set the stage for later guiding women to awaken to their full feminine and masculine strengths?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question, because I'm trying to think, I can say there's a seed code probably that I came to see later. I certainly couldn't say I saw when I was really little in the family dynamic. And I was lucky to grow up, I think, in a very middle-class family, and we had the things that we needed, and a very loving mother, and a very hard-driving father who had, was very accomplished, who actually I admired enormously. But when I was born, there was a story that was told. I actually heard it much later in my life that I was the second child, and that when I was born, my father was so disappointed after the daughter, who was the eldest, that I wasn't a son, that he just, 10 days or something like this after I was born, he wouldn't talk to my mother. He was just like, she should have had a girl.
Oh
She
my
should not
God.
have had a
Talk about
girl.
not being accountable for your responsibility and the sex of your child.
No kidding. Yeah. And he's a scientist. He was a scientist, so you'd think he would know that. But whether it is true or not, because it was told to me by my mother's sister. My mother had passed away. Um, there was something in the template of that, let's say, I could now say about that sort of my little being happy to come into this incarnation and to be on the planet and excited to get into life. And then that sort of feeling of, no, you're not enough. You're somehow not quite right. And interestingly, as my life sort of unfolded, there were other moments like that where I watched my mother, who was very traditional mother of the 50s, 60s, at home, very successful father out there working all the time. And you probably went through that.
I was just thinking the same thing. I had the same experience.
Yeah. So we had that experience, and we had choices, of course, our mothers didn't have, as we grew up. But I watched that dynamic, and I watched my father doing this really exciting life and traveling around the world and doing all things. It was like, I want that life. I do not want this life. And so there were ways I actually would say, now I understand. I pushed away from some of the more nurturing, feminine, all the aspects of my mother that unfortunately it wasn't till much later, and she'd passed away, that I really understood this. And I couldn't say to her, wow, there was so much I learned from you. But I would say those are sort of some of the things that set the stage
for that,
what would unfold in my life. Yeah.
And then you were not only shattered many years later, but you felt betrayed by your husband, David. How? Oh, before I even ask that, I wanted to ask you about your relationship with your husband, David, and describe how he took his life. Just as your first book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead, was completed. And then we'll get to how your life was shattered by that.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think I can make the connection to what we were just talking about, because even though there's a huge span of time, obviously, between those developmental years and all the things that happened in my life before I met David and before he died. But the two big loves of my life, I could say, were my mother, where I felt really safe and seen and a sense of belonging. It was there. In a world I often didn't feel I belonged in. I felt I was very different, very strange. Or, that was just, I'm sure I'm not alone in that sense. So many of us grow up in the world the way it is, feeling like I'm seeing things a little differently than others are.
I'm a little outside this box over here.
Exactly like that. But with David, so David was I was married, and in the process of a very difficult divorce, actually, when I met him. But in many ways, when I met him, I did feel like, oh, here's the David, because when I was younger, I started to have this, and I write about this in my second book. I just had this sort of, I would say, message come to me that about a David. I don't know whether it was in a dream, but that was my partner. And so
it was sort of a premonition, perhaps.
Well, I think that now. I have that now. And I anytime I was dating anybody would be like, is it a David? And what's your name? And my first husband, his father's name was David. So I thought, okay, well, that's fine. That's close enough. Anyway, when I met David, I had this real sort of premonition, for sure, like something just clicked inside me. And as I mentioned, I was going through this difficult divorce at the time. So it wasn't, we weren't immediately in a relationship. But as that did unfold over time, I just dropped into this incredible sense of having met I can't even say soulmate. It's more like, because we were some people talk about twin flame, some people talk about, soulmates, but I'll just say we were cut from the same cloth. And
I understand that. I felt that way about my husband's soul. Yes.
Yeah.
It was like a comfort level. It's like you kind of fit.
Yeah, really, really fit. And I relaxed into our relationship in a way I never had before. And we had an amazing life. I was beginning my research and around women in development. And David was running his business. And so that sort of sets the stage for this very loving, very creative. He had a deep spiritual practice. I also did. So we shared that level of kind of communion, that there was something more in the world than just, the material world.
Yeah, you were living quite a 5D life, I think, before it was even she to be doing that. So when he took his life, though, right as your first book was being completed,
Right.
right?
Well, and to try.
What a surprise and what a shock.
No, it was an enormous shock because he had about 3 months earlier started to get tinnitus, which is that ringing in the head, that people have said can be literally crazy making. It can take over. He was a very sensitive soul. And well, we were starting to get a hold of that, but he, in terms of listening to sounds, and there were some things that he was starting to do. He'd seen some medical people about it. And I thought we had it under control, but there was this other part of him that was, he had no fear of death for sure. He had experiences of other dimensions of reality. So there was a part of him kind of in a half in other worlds, and his business, which was this elaborate business in Indonesian antiques, basically, that spanned. He had a store in Seattle, and then.
By the way, that's a fascinating part of your book. I have to give everyone
Yeah.
an early plug because that was about your book, because that also, just talking about David's business and what he did, was fascinating.
Oh my God, it was phenomenal. And our property on the island here on Vashon, he had brought antique temples and these incredible buildings from Java, transported them over in containers, put them up. It was like we created sort of fields of Bali around the temple. You would go into another world. He had created another world. Well, it turned out that world and the world in Java, where his workshop was, as they say, a castles in the air. We had very separate businesses. I was not aware of all of his financial issues, and he had the financial collapse was basically coming. So this all collided on January 3rd, of his decision to leave this world. And it was right before, 2 days before the wedding of his best friend's daughter, who was running his company, who had arrived from Indonesia. We were all ready for the wedding, which is hard to even conceive. So you have to understand how completely unexpected this was for all of us. That he was suffering, yes, that he was suffering with the tinnitus, but certainly not that he would choose to leave in the way that he did, and at the time that he did. Yeah.
Wow. So that you could understand how that set a tsunami emotion in your life, because it wiped out so much, and it wiped out the outer structures of your life, because you had to deal with all of this with David, and rearrange your inner world. So would you like to talk about that?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's exactly
Wow.
the metaphor I use of the tsunami, because in my book, because the earthquake, you could say, was the event. That was hard enough. It was brutal. Would I go to the wedding? Would I not go to the wedding? How would I, what I was supposed to launch the first program I had done in the work that I do with women and awakening, 5 days later. And after I'd spent a year out working on the book. And so that was about to happen. My life was like, I was ready to go like this. And all of a sudden there was like, boom. So what happened very swiftly was that I became aware of the financial cataclysm, and that of his debt, actually. And so the only asset, and a very large asset, but that all of this debt was woven around, was our incredible property. But that meant I had to sell it very quickly, and I had to sell it in a way that was not a fire sale, in order to cover some of the debts that were. So I canceled, obviously, the program I was running, just to lay the picture. Sometimes
I just want to say something. I can relate to how overwhelming and chaotic this was, because for me personally, when Saul died in that accident, I was left with all these business problems also.
Right.
And it
That.
was scary and so devastating. And here you had on, I was in a terrible car accident. He died next to me, but here, look what happened to you. As I was reading your book, I could totally relate to
Right.
how devastating this was.
Right.
It
Oh,
was like, it's
yes.
like throwing you
Mm.
have dominoes and it's like throwing the tray up in the air and everything's in a different place, right?
Right. Within 6 months. And
Right.
can relate to this. And when I heard your description on your website, your video, I thought she totally understands this. Within 6 months, I had sold the house. My cat had died.
Oh,
My partner was gone. My community, I left this island. I knew it was not the right thing to stay here. I moved into Seattle. I closed my business. I everything was. I use the analogy sometimes. Maybe of the Tibetan. The Tibetan sand mandalas that are
yeah.
created with these painstakingly monks blowing sand through a little fine sieve. And then at the end of it all, after they've created these elaborate complex, they just wipe it all off with a stick. It felt like someone just came into my life. I mean, this event did do that and just said, and here's the interesting thing. The message was you will take everything that I was about to put out in the world on a book into your life. Can you live this? It's like life said, wait a minute now, before you say, because we had definitely, after 10 years of research, we'd worked with hundreds of women in our university programs. We knew some things about women and awakening of consciousness and how to show up in the world in these complex times. It is like life said, yeah, well, let's just see how you handle this. And can you live this way of the Mysterial Woman, as I called it, walking in the darkest night you could
Oh
imagine.
my goodness, yes. I mean, I could really imagine that you were becoming a role model, but you had to live it first to be able to be it.
And it's important to say, while I had a lot of, you could say, certainty from the research I'd done, from the experience I'd had with many, many women, I had a very deep faith in something that there was a path to follow. I was not certain I would get through this. And it's important to distinguish that. I was really, and I had, as I told you, as you named, a very long time spiritual practice. I did have experiences beyond just the ego trying to,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know,
but when you're in the middle of having your world turned upside down and you're dealing with the waves of grief that must have been pouring over you and everything else going on and all that, same thing happened to me. I knew something was up, but holy moly, on this earthbound plane, this was not easy. This
right,
was really tough. So right? Did you
right.
want to add something
No, I
to
just
that?
no, just to say, I think it's important to make this distinction for those that are going through a dark night that may be listening.
Yes.
It isn't that, there is a way you must surrender some of the certainty that shaped your life before, because that's where so much of the suffering happens. If you're trying to hold on to what was before, or you think you should know how it's going to go, or you think you should be certain about what's unfolding, that just that's what I call suffering the suffering. It's hard enough. And I knew, it was going to be hard enough. It was hard enough without layering that on top. So there's sort of like this willingness to walk. That's the title of my second book, we make our path. You
Path
make your
by
path
walking.
walking. You have to walk into the mystery and trust that actually is the way forward. The mind will say, oh no, I got to figure this out. I got to figure this out. But the truth is, your mind and trauma, and this I knew from the work I was already doing, the work I do with women is around trauma. Um, you know, the mind and trauma can only see a very limited path forward. And what your future will look like will not be the future you really want to go to. Something much greater is actually possible, but you have to be willing to be with the mystery.
Well,
Yeah.
for me, and I think you'll agree with me, for me, it's about letting go of control because you
Uh-huh.
no longer have control and kind of learning to go with the flow and letting go is a challenge all by itself. So, right, that's a deep lesson that comes out of an experience like this.
It certainly can. I mean, and that's why we're underlining it here together, because the you could say the reptilian brain is going to try to grab onto something familiar. I got to stay here. I got to do this thing.
Right.
But actually, the faith or the trust that something like I could not have imagined the life I'm living now. I really couldn't have imagined it, and I knew I couldn't. So holding yourself exactly where you are. You only need to see the next lily pad that's right there. That one you need to see. You need to know where to put your next foot, but not 10 lily pads
Right,
out.
because there's so many variables. So I want to talk to you. I know you've got these two wonderful books, and one is very award-winning. Now you're up with your second one, but could you talk to us about in your award-winning book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, you use a blend of cutting-edge transformational psychology, which I love, ancient mystery school secrets, and visionary evolutionary thinking to describe a woman who is awakening to the next level of consciousness and leadership. So for everybody who's on the edge of their seats now, what is this next level of consciousness and leadership? And what is a mysterial woman? Can any woman become a mysterial woman?
Yeah, I love the question. You're right in my zone. And also, I want to just say to the men who are listening, it's true, the research that we did was with women, but I've had many men read my first book, and my second book is for men and women, of course, in that sense, but would really relate to the feminine and masculine distinctions that we identified. So it's important to say the word mysterial kind of was given to me. It was given to me when my co-author Susan Cannon and I were working on the book and sort of compiling what we had begun to see with women. We're looking for a way to describe this way of being, a way of being that we were witnessing of women who had the capacity to be with uncertainty and ambiguity, who could, bring in information from all sorts of sort of this diffuse awareness that's needed so much in the world right now, being able to hold multiple streams of information at the same time, to call in information from other levels, to use our intuition as well as our rational brain and so on. And we were looking for a word to describe it, and we couldn't find one. And one day this word just came in, and I said, they're just like, they're mysterial. And then the two of us looked at each other like we had given birth to something, like
That's
something,
it.
that potency of naming something. And we did a ritual right after the name, because it felt like we've just named something, and it's going to have a life of its own. And it doesn't. So yes, anyone can. In fact, I would say this is women and men, but are in this process right now being pushed and pulled by the evolutionary forces of these times to bring online what I call a completely new inner operating system. And this is, one talk I did one time at a leadership conference in Rome for women, I was speaking to this, and I had probably like 100 young women come up to me afterward and say they were so grateful to hear that there was a new model, because they knew, they were women in business who they knew it wasn't what they saw their mothers doing, which was very often the toxic masculine. It was and I was in that role in myself. I understood that. I lived very much in the masculine management consulting world and became one of the boys, you could say. They knew it wasn't that. They knew it wasn't going back to the goddesses. So what is the future? And that, I would say, has to do with this way of being that's trying to come online now because of the complexity of these times.
And we need it, and we need it, and we need this feminine presence in the
Feminine and
world.
masculine. Well, what's actually needed is, and that's what we spent 10 years figuring out, what is feminine? And it's not just as a glob of feminine, and what is masculine. And that was the research. And that is something we ended up calling the mysterial sequence, where we actually differentiated the feminine and masculine aspects so that we could begin to uproot the old codes that have shaped who we are as women. It's almost like literally this this is what I ended up living, after my own tragedy with David, was stepping into this way of being where I called on all of my feminine and masculine strengths, but they had to weave together in a way that allowed me to go through this to create the life that I have now.
So is that what you call the mysterial operating system?
Yeah, that's
Tell
right.
us about that, and then follow that, please, by telling us about your new book, You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide through trauma and loss. And I have a feeling they're very connected. So
they're very connected, because the weaving, the inner operating system of a mysterial, basically, is a deep sense. There are some codes that we identified that connect to 5 masculine and feminine archetypes in a developmental pathway from when we're babies all the way up to when we're in the crone years. It starts with the mother archetype, moves to the hero archetype, then to the father archetype, to the maiden, and ultimately the crone. And each of those has a limiting code to them. That is not just laid down in our own lives, but it's transgenerational. It is the trauma of living inside a patriarchal paradigm for over 5,000 years. So that's a long time. And that wasn't wrong, by the way. That was life's, in my view, that was evolution's move forward. It's just that, like Einstein said, the problems of today can't be solved with the consciousness that created them yesterday. We have to actually create,
That is a wonderful quote for mankind.
For
you know what?
Well, it's urging it, for any of us. I'm a developmental psychologist, so it's like saying, turn on the developmental tap. But so many, of us feel like we're developed. Well, I'm an adult. I can drive a car. I have a partner. I have children. But no, actually, this something else is trying to awaken, and very often, inside the trauma moments, these old codes, and I'm just going to tell them to you. The first archetype with the mother, it's I'm not enough, and your listeners can see if they can relate to any of these. The second one with the hero archetype of the masculine is I have to do to be of value. Mm-hmm. The third one with the father is I don't belong. Then with the maiden, it's not safe to express myself fully. And then the crone, I don't have enough knowledge, influence, and connections. Those codes are deep down in the DNA, and they are running us. So until we do the shadow work, which is the work I've figured out to do, this sort of pointed shadow work, and of course I have my own time in the Shadowlands, as we've described, then this, it's almost like this birth wants to happen. These next level capacities start to come online.
So the mysterial, I want to just get straight, the mysterial operating system has to do with those capacities.
Yeah,
They're
that's
all
right.
connected.
So it's like the operating system is a way of being, the way I see myself, I see others, and I see the world. That's we could talk about as consciousness. Now, because I have that operating system, I can do a lot of things. If you use the computer metaphor, I have these new ways of showing up. I can put these new programs on. It doesn't crash all the time. I can actually engage with this world that's in so much uncertainty right now and so much dynamic change and so much complexity. So the capacities arise, from this inner operating system.
And tell us a little bit about your book, because it deals with trauma, it deals with loss, it's a guide. So what would you like everyone to know about that?
Right. Well, the first thing I did after David died was about a year later, I came back to the first book, which we hadn't found a publisher yet. It hadn't come out. That came out. That was the first thing to do. It never occurred to me I was going to write a book about my experience. But about 5 years after he died, I just felt like I needed to go back over the trauma ground for myself. And many who have gone through their own loss journeys probably have experienced something similar. It's like I need to write myself back together. And I took myself away on writing retreats and started to do that, to just write myself through.
Must have been very cathartic and healing for you.
Enormously cathartic. And I did it I had friends on, I did it by myself, but friends knew I was doing it, and I could call if I got overwhelmed. And I was in a beautiful place in nature, and I took my time and went slowly to walk over that ground of the trauma again. And as I began to do that, the interesting thing was it hadn't occurred to me until I was doing that I was living in the very last chapter of the first book. We had identified these 8 what we called meta capacities that are needed right now to meet the world. Things like multidimensional knowing, embracing paradox, authentic presence, tending the field. Anyway, all these fun names we came up with, there are 8 of them, that I'd actually been living that. Like, that's what I'd actually been doing. And so there was a way it started to integrate something in me. Like, I could see, I don't know, maybe why I went through this, like to really hardwire this in myself, that these hold up, this way of being holds up when the worst possible thing that could happen to me, in this case, happened. So that became the second book. Then I began to reveal itself. Well, I didn't even know it would be a book. I showed this to the editor from the first book, what I'd written, and she said, "Oh, you have to share this with others, because it's your personal memoir. It's how it's the honest story of what it was for you, and also the tools you used and how you went through in a way that I hope can be a guide as people make their path by walking.
I think your book offers comfort, guidance, and inspiration. It helps people make meaning out of loss. And I think it could be a very helpful book to people who are going through trauma and grief and all of that, truly. And I also want to ask you about the spiritual practices that you use that help you navigate this grief, betrayal, and loss, which you speak about in the book. Could you share them with us, please?
Yeah. Well, probably the deepest one would be I had an ongoing meditation practice since I had a spiritual awakening when I was young. It's about 17. So a long time ago that put me, I would say, on a path the rest of my life to which the awakening just had to do with
Wait a
feeling.
minute, I just have to ask you this tongue in cheek. So you were in this masculine world, but you had developed this sort of spiritual sense of things. So did that help you as it took you through? It must have been a little bit of a dichotomy or whatever, because in this masculine world that you originally were in, you were still spiritual during that time.
I actually was part of a spiritual community at that time.
Wow.
But I would go undercover. I felt like I was an undercover agent. And I actually did feel that, of having the skill and capacity to work with the C-suite of, big international companies and do it in a very, very powerful professional way and awaken hearts and, bring people into the experience of, later I would say, was the awakening of a more integrated leadership style. At that time, I didn't have the feminine and masculine principles so distinguished, but I always felt I was sort of undercover, an undercover agent. Yeah. So the spiritual practice, just to say, has always been a very deep part of my life. And the fundamental part I want to bring in there was a sense of I am part of a beautiful, unfolding, interconnected world, and that it isn't only this human journey. Some I've talked about it as a divinely human journey that we're on, like how we are and who we are is this what I would now call a waking down. I think because of some of the earlier practices I did have and spiritual paths I was on, I had the tendency to do what you could call a spiritual bypass, where I would be able to just, like I think David actually did, to have connections at other levels.
You're talking about through meditation.
Right, through meditations and making everything all right, and it's all good and it's all bliss and it's all no, actually, I was committed to this when David died. I will do this by staying really connected to my emotional body, by staying really connected to my physical body, to myself. I will not do it as a spiritual bypass. So that meant, that the practices I had that were meditation, yes, but also being in my body, being in my heart, opening my heart to others, staying connected to this rich, loving field of belonging.
That's actually just living on the planet with your heart open is a spiritual practice in so many ways, right?
Well, especially during something like this, because there were lots of reasons to want to shut that down when you are involved in a suicide, as those will know.
And people are coming after you for money and financial problems and all of that.
Suicide, the shame of suicide is something that any of us who are suicide survivors have to navigate. And I was really, really committed to doing that, to not hiding away, to not isolating, because, one of the most important things in my own healing had to do with community, had to do with connecting to a heart field around me. I was shattered, but I had right away this very strong community of women and family who came to be around me, and they became, and I knew I needed this, kind of like a tuning fork for my own shatter. Like I could tune myself to that love field, not the shame.
Right. And there was, in that love field, there was not a lot of judgment. There was more acceptance for what had happened to you and love for, but you did have shifts and transformations and in your relationships.
Oh my, yes.
You want to talk? Because I did also. I think,
Yes.
I mean, talk about things that shatter you.
Yes.
Right. So you want to talk about that, because anyone going through trauma and going, oh my God, my relationship is changing, or this is going on, and you need to in some way form new community, form a new tribe. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I wouldn't say I had to form a new tribe. I'd say the tribe that was around me came in around me because, and I let them. I had been in the work that I did. I was the transformational teacher, and this would be the thing that would not happen to me. I had honestly the most magical life, and hard to believe life, because here I was with my beloved in this absolutely extraordinary estate, doing the work I loved, living in this beautiful community on an island. I mean, this doesn't happen to me. And so there was a way in which the shift for my community, for me to be the one receiving, to be the one, I think the heroic me that could show up for anything, anywhere, do anything, help other people, be there for everyone else, was shattered. It was like that heroic self, that part of my ego, which I didn't even see, it was invisible to me, was gone. And there was something so much, almost like the breaking open of my own heart broke me into the world in a way that I was forever and was very changed by. Almost like I could take you in, could take others in, could receive in ways I never had been able to before, could feel the suffering of others in ways I could never feel it before. That even though, this was the work I did in the world, I felt I was a very compassionate person, but
But it
my own.
changes you, it transforms you in so many ways. And how you transform, by the way, in the middle of your despair. I just want to share this story because talk about opening your heart and how it changed. You talk in your book about the meta capacity called Embracing Paradox. And you actually encountered a young man named Sean who lived on the razor's edge between despair and hope. And he has that was such an amazing story. And talk about transformation, I loved how you dealt with the situation that happened. It was in a very spiritual, I would say evolved way. And it wasn't long into your
No, it's
suffering.
only a couple of months. But what's interesting about that, and I'll just tell the story briefly if you'd like.
Yeah, please do. I thought it was an amazing story.
The difference here would have been like maybe my heroic self would have wanted to do something like what I did. I don't know, but basically I did not have that self on board. This literally is what arose for me. So I was setting the house up with a friend had come over to help me sort of begin to edit things for the house staging I would have to do to sell the house. And one of the properties on our building was this amazing old antique Javanese house that we had as a guest house. And we went outside and we were looking at things, and all of a sudden I see smoke coming out of the fireplace of that house. Well, this is like a 17-acre estate. Nobody gets into the property.
Right. Now, how long after it was 3 months after
No,
the
just a couple of months, maybe two.
wow,
Yeah,
wow,
it was
wow,
so it was traumatizing just to see somebody.
wow.
There must have been somebody in there. So anyway, my friend and I go running into the building. We see this young boy, and he's freaked out that we're coming in there, and I'm freaked out that he's there, and he's got all of these things, many of David's things, out on the table, and he's obviously been rifling through the guest house.
How old would you say he was?
Probably 13, 14, like a teen. It's hard to tell, very skinny, scrawny guy. And he kind of rose up like in his, I'll fight. What is this? But he's also looking terrified. And so we went through this whole encounter, like, what are you doing here? And the first words out of his mouth were, I'm staying next door with my dad is building a pizza oven for Leah, and I'm staying next door, and I wanted to see the dead man's house. So he'd obviously heard his parent or his father talking and about this. So he'd come over. Well, like even that was just hard for me. So
Well, violation. It was like a
enormous
violation.
enormous violation at a time when I was obviously still very traumatized. So we march him back over to his father. Oh, and then as we're heading out the door, he has this big bag stuffed with all of these things.
Oh, his mementos that were David's.
David's little birth certificate. I mean, a whole bunch of stuff, plus this little amulet necklace with a little scarab beetle in it in resin that I'd gotten from my sister in China. All these things. I said, you'll be leaving these here, and he puts them down. Okay, fine. So we march over there, and there's this whole encounter that happens. That people can read more about this in the book, so I won't go into all the details, but it became very clear to me quickly the trouble he had with his father. His father was very mean to him. Understandably, he should have been strict about what had just happened, but there was something that happened. I could see the defeat and the sense of I'm nothing, I'm hopeless that this little boy had. And okay, we went back to the property, and then I went back into the house where I'd left him, and I saw the knives, these big cooking knives on the counter that were out and that he'd obviously taken out. And it's just like something inside me just felt like, I think I could feel David. I could feel, was this boy, now that I'd seen him interact with his father and the way that he felt he was such a failure and he was a piece of, caca himself.
Which is probably what he was told all the time.
Well, I'm sure he was told that all the time. And that was his difficult circumstance. But I thought, did he come over here to kill himself? Would he have killed himself if I hadn't found him? And something just broke open in me. There was the correct, the paradox was there were some boundaries to be set with him. But then there was also the compassionate, loving extension. So I saw this little scarab necklace on the table, and the dung beetle, it eats, it lives by eating the difficult things of life, And so I asked my friend if he would take it to him, to the little boy next door, and tell him what I had said, which was, you're not, the difficult things happen, but you can get through this and some other things.
I mean, I loved in the book because you said some really very wonderful things, which is probably the first time in his life he had ever heard anything like that.
But the thing, maybe, I do feel I also did it for me, because I feel like in some way I was speaking to the younger David, in some way I was, maybe the David I wish I could have talked to before he took his life, So there was something in it, like I needed to do that. And
it was healing for you also.
It was healing for me. I never, of course, expected anything, but then, maybe a month later, I got this little letter all wrinkled up and, carefully written from him, saying, with all the misspellings, I wrote it in the book, and it actually touches me just to remember it. Just, his, thank you so much for the necklace. And if you ever, me and my dad can come over and do any projects you might need at the house. If you ever need anything, just let me know. Now, I was clear I couldn't do that. I wasn't ready to look after, I couldn't go that step, but I had wondered how he was, I even wonder today, I wonder if he's alive still, or was that a moment, this is all those times, right, where you can meet the things that come to you in lots of different ways. And do you change other lives by just the way you show up with kindness and compassion?
Yes. And I believe you can. I believe that might have been, he might have grown up and considering that a sign, or holding on to that. I thought it was so wonderful. And I also wanted to have you explain to everyone what so in a nutshell, your holistic and transformative approach to leadership. And I'd like you to also talk about the classes and workshops you hold, everything that you do, because you're so approachable and you're so knowledgeable. I think a lot of people listening, probably both men and women listening to this interview, would think about reaching out to you for a new paradigm, a new way of dealing with this kind of new world we're finding ourselves in as it's transforming.
That's right. Yeah. Well, really being able to show up for the times the way they are, because we aren't going back to any certainty anytime soon. We are in complex, some people call it a tipping point time in culture. What we do know from just futurists is that we don't need the whole population to be have a consciousness that shapes a positive outcome. We do need a small percentage of the population. I would say that would be women and men on the edge of evolution. But if you're on the edge of evolution, if you're someone probably listening to this podcast, you're someone who does want to grow, who is curious, who wants to show up differently. And the work I do and have spent years doing is creating I would say accelerated, even though it's a commitment in time. My main program for women is a year-long program, 15-month program, but where it's almost like I've had so many women come into my work who've done many other change things and many other programs and had weekend epiphanies, but didn't make the developmental move. Well, I'm interested in, I suppose it's probably important to say, I'm not interested in helping the self that's here now. That self-help, there are lots of places you can go for that are great. That's just not what I do. I'm interested in encouraging the next level of development of your unfolding, which means there's going to be discomfort, and you're already feeling it if you're drawn to my work. There's a way in which your own, the way you're showing up in the world and isn't the way you want to be, or you're not in the right kind of relationship, so you're not doing what you love to do, you're not making the contribution you want to make, or you're stuck in the birth canal in some way, you're in the middle of a transition. And so that's the deep work I do in the Mysterial Leadership Emergence program. The next one's actually opening up in October. We just finished the final in-person retreat. This is a global program, so I have women all over the world that participate, and then we come together for a final week. We just finished that 2 weeks ago. So I'm fresh off of that incredible experience of.
It must be so rewarding when you see the changes and transformations in people.
Absolutely. And when you meet in person, because we do this deep work with awakening the feminine and masculine essences in ourselves, and then we've worked together very intimately for a long time, and then we meet in person, which is just amazing. So that's what I do in that program. We have the resourcing sanctuary, which is a way to come in and touch the work. That's about a 7-week program where you experience what it is to bring these next level capacities, meta capacities online, and then the mother capacities, the operating system level that we have to develop for that to happen.
And you also have a coaching program, right?
We coach. Well, there are a lot of coaches who do my work who are people, psychologists and coaches, and that I find it hard to find the kind of containers they need for themselves. They're caring for a lot of people, but they want a container that has the rigor of the research we've done, that has the understanding of psychological development, but also we use a lot of ritual and working with the imaginal and beauty and art and poetry and neuroscience, that has all of that complexity. So that's available. The coaching, so we have a Mysterial coach and training program that is that you can do after you've done the actual program itself. So we have this emerging, people can work one-on-one with me. I've just opened that up again, and with our Mysterial coaches. So
wonderful. And you do it all. Some of it is in person, some of it's online, I imagine.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. It's a combination. Do you have a special offer for our grief and rebirth?
Right. What I've set up is the first few chapters of my new book, You Make Your Path by Walking, a transformational field guide for trauma and loss, because I thought that would be a great way for someone to get in to taste my transmission, you could say, of the work I'm doing and my own personal story. And I think you'll have a link for that. So
we will. We for sure. I would think someone who's I'm sorry to interrupt. I just was thinking someone who is really immersed in their practice and in what they're doing, but they feel like they need more. They're ready for the next step. I would imagine that your program would be terrific for them.
For sure. And even just getting connected to our, what we call a mysterial murmuration, which is those great flocks of birds that all fly together. Coming in, you can get on the mailing list, and I send out newsletters with, the things that I'm thinking about. And so that's a way to connect. We're on social media. You can find it. We have a Facebook group, have Instagram, and LinkedIn, and so on. So I would say if you feel a resonance with me and what I'm sharing, then reach out and get connected to our movement.
And because the mission of this podcast has such passion for healing, tell me, please, Suzanne, how our wounded places can become the opportunities for our healing and our gift to others.
Yes, well, that is, the expression of the wounded healer, which is really just saying the places in you that have been carved open by life circumstances, often not ones we wanted when we were younger, or even transgenerational trauma, or events that happen, traumas that happen, like I'm describing in my adult life. How you are with what happens once you're broken open is everything. But there's no question, I'm able, what I can offer now, I think I was already offering, I think, something of value and meaning in the programs we ran before David died. But I now have a place of meeting people because of not just the trauma I went through, because you couldn't go through trauma and not be changed, but because of how I went through that trauma, how I lived through that, who I have become through that. And that has its own transmission, actually. So the wounded, it's not even like the healers necessarily talk about what they've done. It's just, I'm sure when people meet you, they're just who you are. I can feel it in our conversation because of what's happened to you. You have a place to hold these deep conversations. That's just who you are.
It's true. It breaks you open. It really breaks you open, and it. I like to say it changes your cells as they're multiplying when you have these kinds of experiences, and eventually you find out that it's in its weird way, it's a blessing. The way because you can translate it to helping so many more people because you have a depth of understanding.
And the main thing on that I want to add is, you made me think of it, is that it is sometimes when you're in the middle of something, and I know I had to keep calling myself back. You're like, let me just get through this thing, and I'll get through this. If I survive this, I'll be of value to others, or I'll get out there. Meanwhile, you're missing the life that is. It's almost like when and if you're listening to this now and you're going through a dark night, this is your life. This is not the life, you don't get this back. You don't get this day back. You don't get this moment life. It is actually this right now. And you can learn to see in the dark. You can, and actually, if I think of the union of feminine and masculine, in the yin yang symbol, the feminine is the dark. It's like really learning to embrace the dark, not run away from it, but let it open you, be present for that, because that is, in my experience, how I see what the next step is. And the next step that might lead to ultimately some way I am at the other side able to say, I can receive this as a blessing. Not because you do it as a spiritual bypass at the beginning, because I surely did not do that.
I totally get that. And with all of this said, and I'm so enjoying this interview. And with all this said, I would love to know the Suzanne Anderson tip for finding joy in life.
Well, for me, it's slowing myself down, and maybe it just connects to what I was saying, and savoring this moment. I have a practice that I do every day where I take a walk after lunch, and I have not listening to anything. I'm just walking, a simple walk. It's not getting exercise. It's just being with the awe of life, of just the moment, of the flower that's there today and it wasn't yesterday. I was just listening to a podcast about someone who was referencing the San Bushman in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa, and how when he was with them, sometimes they would just erupt in laughter. But there wasn't anything, and they live in hard circumstance. It was like he was speaking to what I could relate to here, of like joy as a bedrock even in the midst of the struggle. So we don't often find it if we're going really fast. So you got to slow yourself down, be present to the awe of life itself.
That's beautiful. And I must say, joy and all those other emotions, they can live together. And I always tell people, let that joy in. That's also part of your experience. Suzanne, in closing, I would really like to share this very meaningful passage from your book, which is so illuminating. And I'm going to say the title again to everyone. You make your path by walking. I would like to share this passage from your book. The person I have become through the trauma and loss is also stronger, more resilient, more compassionate, kinder to herself, and more loving to others. And there are also times when I feel the ache deep down in my bones for the love that I had with David, for what was between us and what might have been. And I recognize that this too is just what it means to be fully in this human life, daring to love with all your heart and willing to lose what you think you cannot live without. Suzanne, thank you from my heart for inviting women to step into their power, embrace their wholeness, and contribute to a better world, becoming lights in the world that others can look to in their time of need. And I truly thank you from my heart for this enlightening and moving interview today on Grief and Rebirth podcast.
Thank you, Irene. What a pleasure and privilege, really, to be in this deep listening field with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And here's a loving reminder, everyone, that you can see the show notes and all Grief and Rebirth podcast episodes at ireneweinberg.com. And make sure to follow us and like us on social at Irene S. Weinberg on Instagram, Facebook, or whenever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. As I like to say, to be continued. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Many blessings, everyone, and bye for now.